My name is Henk Berg. I'm a professor of German in the Department of Languages and Cultures at the University of Sheffield. I'm one of the two organizers of this lecture series, together with my colleague Bob Stern over there, who's in the Department of Philosophy. Our speaker today is the world-famous religious commentator, writer, and broadcaster Karen Armstrong, and we're very honored and pleased to have her. Karen is the author of several best-selling books, including, perhaps most famously, this one, A History of God. Her topic today is sacred nature. So, without further ado, let us start. Please welcome Karen Armstrong.
Now, we all know that the climate is in danger. We all know there's an emergency, and that before the century ends, we have to change our ways. But we're not sure how to do it. And part of the problem for us here, I think, in the West, is the sense that we are not particularly emotional about nature, about the natural world. And that's what I'll be talking about this evening. Every single world religion, with the exception of the Judeo-Christian religions, sees nature as a source of the divine. And I'll talk about that and show how that God wasn't stuck up in the heavens. God was in everything. And people cultivated that awareness, so nature was sacred. And we talk very much, aren't we, about in scientific terms, but it's hard to feel emotional about emissions, for example, or what we can do about it. And at first, I think we've got to try and recover that sense of reverence that we had for nature at some point long ago, and learn from other religious traditions how to do that. Because we need to feel this. It's not just a question of slowing down on petrol, etc. Somehow we've got to feel for nature and realize that it is sacred. And what we'll look at in this is to show how people saw nature as a sacred, as the home of the sacred, rather than a God in the heavens. We talk, don't we, that Our Father begins, Our Father who art in heaven, and straight away we've got God separate from humanity. I don't think that is a Latin translation, Pater Noster qui es in celis. I'm not sure that that's a good translation of the Greek. It would probably be something like, more like Our Heavenly Father, as opposed to our earthly Father here on earth. Our Heavenly Father, not meaning stuck up in the heavens, as we'll see. And since the modern period, we're looking at nature differently. In fact, we're not very good at looking at things at all. People, have you noticed how often you're on a beach, a beautiful beach, and you'll see someone chattering on the phone rather than looking at the magnificence of the sea and relishing being in it. And this is the phone is almost killing us. I mean, you see, instead of looking and being in the presence of nature, we take a photograph. And I spend a great deal of time in the British Museum. I used to be a trustee. And I noticed that instead of people coming in to see the Rosetta Stone and just being in its presence, they take a photograph and then they go away. It's as though they want to keep this thing, but not be in its presence. Realize that they're in the presence of something extraordinary. Somehow we've got to cultivate this, because we can't just do this. We can't just save the planet simply by talking in scientific terms that don't move us at all, about emissions, etc. Nearly all the world religions, what we call God, is not confined to the heavens. It is, as I've said, in nature. And that's the kind of insight that we've got to cultivate, perhaps bit by bit, learning how to do it. We used to have it in the West, and it's become even more pronounced since the scientific period. Now, Thomas Aquinas knew that God was everywhere. Thomas Aquinas, the great theologian of the 13th century, he says that God is not confined to the heavens. God is everywhere. But he put it in rather dry terms. He was very keen on Aristotle, and that was the beginning of something that was happening and would become much more acute as the centuries grew on. In the 15th century, before students at the new universities that had cropped up throughout Europe, before they learned any divinity, they started with Aristotelian science. Those were their early years. They were inducted into their university career by Aristotle. I don't know how many of you read Aristotle, but he is not an emotional writer. He was a brilliant scientific writer. And people talked about science in this scientific way, and nature in this scientific way. So when they arrived in the divinity school, they read the Bible through the lens of Aristotle. Now, the Bible is not Aristotelian. It's a very emotional book, as you know, and it calls upon deep things in our psyches. But Aristotle made it scientific, and so there was a separation beginning between our involvement in nature, and that was going to increase over the years. In the 16th and 17th century, for example, Francis Bacon said that human beings had failed to honor God's command to Adam. You remember, he says, fill the earth and pursue it. He says, we've got to conquer the earth. We've disobeyed God by just praying in nature. We've got to exploit it. And we're behaving like pagans. It's only pagans who worship or honor the sea, the wind, the sun. We've got to go for God, and it's there for us. He said, conquer it and make use of it. We must now exploit nature and make it advance scientifically and culturally. Now, that was the beginning. The great philosopher René Descartes retreated from nature. Do you remember when he worked out his great conundrum, I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum? He was taking part in the 30 Years' War of the 17th century, and he found that he was caught in a storm, and he isolated himself from the world in a hut. And there, shut off from nature, shut off from humanity, he worked out this philosophy. I think, therefore I am. And the universe, Descartes said, is lifeless and dead. This is quite different from how, as we shall see, other cultures had regarded nature. It was a machine rather like the new machines that were just being invented in Europe at that time, clocks and things. He said, the universe is like a machine, and we must use it like a machine. There should be, and we don't want awe. We don't want to feel marvels or awestruck in front of nature. He said, for example, in the future, now we know what clouds consist of, we want no more wonder at the clouds. All wonder is to be gone. We must treat nature scientifically as something that must be exploited and used to advance our sense of the world, our command of the world. And then, of course, Newton, Isaac Newton, took this a step further. And he saw God as very much in his own image. When asked, he said this God was obviously very well versed in mechanics and geometry, just like Newton himself. He said that nature was seen as God had created the world and then left it to its own devices. And you know, many people today who say they can't believe in God are believing in Newton's God, of God actually sort of creating a world like a sort of magician and bringing it into being. But this is not how other people, as we're going to see in other parts of the world, in other religious traditions, have ever seen that. We in the West have developed a very peculiar idea of God. I remember at school, maybe you yourself had to learn catechisms. And what is God was the catechism question. And in one sentence, we chanted, God is the supreme spirit who alone exists of himself and is infinite in all perfections. Now, I can't say at the age of 8 that meant very much to me, but I now think it's quite incorrect. God is not just a spirit separated from us. God is, as we'll see in every other tradition, deeply at the heart. The divine goes throughout all nature and is in all persons. That's why in India, when people greet each other, they join their hands and they're bowing. They're bowing to the divinity that they're meeting in the other person. And these bodily actions, as we know, affect our minds very deeply. We're not just thinking machines. We learn a great deal from the gestures and postures of our body. But how are we going to get back to what nature should be? The first people to realize that something was going very wrong were not scientists or theologians. They were poets, and romantic poets, Wordsworth and Coleridge. And those of you who remember Tintern Abbey will remember how Wordsworth said he had taught himself to look at nature differently. He said, I have learned to look at nature differently. And that meant he was using what he called the imagination. Now, we sort of think of the imagination as something that's a bit airy-fairy, perhaps, or not scientific. But for the Romantic poets, it meant looking beneath the surface of things and seeing the meaning, the inner meaning, or the preciousness of that. And he said, in his great poem, Tintern Abbey, he said, I have learned to look at nature Not as I did when I was a youth, when he just was exultant in the glories of the Lake District and ran around like a child. He'd learned, this is what we have to do too. We have to learn to think and see nature differently. And he said, so that now he doesn't just see trees and flowers and clouds. He says he can hear the still sad music of humanity, nor harsh, nor grating, though of ample power to chasten and subdue. And I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose presence is the light of setting suns, and the deep ocean, and the living air, and the blue sky, and in the mind of man. A motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. And he had really worked to change his mind to perceive that. This, as we shall see, what he's just said about the divinity rolling through all things, was absolutely essential to most of the other major world traditions. It was natural to humanity to do that. They weren't told by some god to do that. This was how people responded to nature, with reverence. His friend Coleridge, of course, wrote a very famous poem, which I'm sure you all learned about at school, called The Ancient Mariner. And you remember that the Ancient Mariner, he's at a wedding, he grabs a wedding guest and starts telling his sad story. And he tells us how he and his ship set off for Netherlands, and they went down to the Antarctic region. There they got sort of hemmed in with all the icebergs and the ice. But then suddenly, through the air, an albatross appeared and flew on the boat. An albatross, a white bird, a big white bird with very light, wide, slender wings. And it became the crew made it their mascot, and they fed it, and it would visit would visit them all day, and they loved this bird. It comforted them, and indeed they felt that the albatross had actually steered them out of all this ice and taken them away from this. And then suddenly the wedding guest notices that the mariner has gone pale. He says, "What ails thee so?" And he just says a few words, no more. "With my crossbow, I shot the albatross." And he gives no reason for it. He didn't, the albatross wasn't misbehaving, or he gives no reason for it. And I think that speaks to us today. Because in a sense, we are constantly, all of us, I'm sure, messing up the environment, the natural environment, without giving it a single thought. We're still dumping stuff near the sea, even though we've been told that this is absolutely dreadful. We're still sort of using huge amounts of petrol. Instead, we drive our cars instead of taking a train, without thinking. And with my crossbow, I shot the albatross. And then, of course, he has broken the bond with nature, and nature is no longer functioning. And terrible things happen. They get becalmed in the hot ocean sea. All his companions, who'd at first been horrified that he'd shot the bird, but then said, oh, it's all right, they all die. And as they die, each one of them looks at the albatross, looks at the mariner with hatred. And his soul passes by the mariner, and he hears the whiz of his crossbow, of the arrow that shot the albatross. And he looks at the sea snakes, and he just dismisses them as slimy things. And then suddenly, one night, he looks up at the moon. And Coleridge, this is a ballad, as you'll remember, but he writes a gloss beside this verse, one of the most beautiful lines in the poem, but it's not poetry. And he says that he looks up at the moon and he sees it suddenly as a traveler like himself. The moon is always traveling. And he said it's like someone coming home and being greeted by all his companions and servants and relations. And for once, instead of just seeing nature as dead, he's seen it as something alive that is speaking to him. And this changes him. He looks at the water snakes and he says, a spring of love gushed from my heart, and I blessed them unaware. And at that moment, the curse is lifted. And, you know, we all sort of think of nature so without identifying it. You have to learn to look at it as he did, imaginatively, somehow associating the movements of nature with our own emotions, with our own happenings. Of course, nature is different, and as we know, very different. It has its own life, and that is very much respected. But also, we have to use our imagination, and that's exactly what Wordsworth is doing. The Romantics were very, very strong on imagination, looking further, deeper than the surface, and looking at something that is not immediately apparent and relating it to ourselves. And that's the end. The mariner goes on, and he is saved by that act of sudden identification with nature. Now, the religions, though, were there way before that. And in the 17th century, the Jesuits, the members of the Society of Jesus, were very, very good scientists, some of them. Some of these Jesuits in this religious order were key members of the Royal Society, which has just opened up in London. And so they go to China as missionaries. And they would dress up like the Chinese literati in Chinese clothes. And the Confucian scholars were very interested in what they had to say, because a lot of scientific stuff had been happening in Europe. Copernicus' theory, you know, all that was new, and they were fascinated by it. But there was one thing that they could not stomach. As one of them said, they are very detailed in material forces, but deficient in ki. Now, the Chinese don't have a creation story. They must be probably one of the few cultures in the world that don't have a creation story. But they see nature as imbued with a force that is sacred, that is both, and beyond our knowledge, beyond our ken. It is both physical and non-physical. And it is that key that lies at the heart of the natural order. And our task, they said, is to cultivate that key. That's the most important thing that the Chinese did. It transcends all categories, and it's present everywhere in everything, both physical and non-physical. It goes beyond what we can know, but it is crucial to it is also within us, as well as in the flowers, trees, winds, and animals. And we too, that's the sort of thing that we too have to cultivate. The idea, the Greeks Orthodox had a very different notion than the West about God. They didn't have this idea of a God up in heaven. The Greeks had a long tradition before they became Christian of a nature cult in the Artemis, the goddess Artemis, who was present everywhere in nature. You never saw her, but she was present in every flower and every leaf and every river and every stream. And that infused, when they became Christian, the Greeks, the Greek Christians. And they were, when the Western Christians arrived during the Crusades, they were very, very puzzled by the way they treated the Holy Land. The Europeans, they would arrive and they would burst into tears. They would fling themselves on the ground and kiss it and said, "We've now arrived in the Holy Land." And the Chinese are saying, and the Greeks are saying, well, what are they talking about? All land is sacred. You don't have to come all this way just because Jesus was here, because your land is equally sacred. But we in the West had already begun to move away from this. Later Chinese people, to get back to China, Mencius, who came after Confucius, he said the golden rule was, which we know is at the heart of our morality, was also something that was applied to nature. Confucius had been the first person in the world, as far as we know, to formulate the golden rule. He was asked what was the most important thing in his philosophy, and what he would advise people to do, and what people must do if they wish to become human. And he said, "Do not impose on others what you yourself do not desire. Look into your own heart, discover what gives you pain, and then refuse under any circumstance whatsoever to inflict that pain on anyone else. Do not impose on others what you yourself do not desire." But later philosopher Mencius, he said that also applies to nature. We must treat all the natural world as we would wish to be treated ourselves, because they are our companions. He talked about the things of nature. A Chinese word, wanwu. I'm not sure if that's how it's pronounced, but that's how it's spelt when it's wanwu. Now, when we talk about a thing, we mean something pretty inanimate, don't we? When you put your things away, we don't see them as alive. But the wanwu are alive because they're infused by the qi. Just as humans, just as the sun is, just as each human being is, all are infused by this sacred force of qi. And so they must be treated with the same consideration that we apply to ourselves. And we see the Golden Rule as absolutely crucial to humanity. All the world religions, quite independently, developed their own version of the Golden Rule and said that that was the essence of religion. But in the West, we didn't extend that to we're not extending that to nature. The Chinese are saying the One Wu must be treated too, as we would wish to be treated ourselves. Other Chinese, Laozi, saw the author of the Tao Te Ching. He talked about a force from which everything and every creature in the world derives, and which is present in the heart of all beings, animal, vegetable, or mineral. This power holds the world together, and without it, we are lost. But in order for us to share this, we have to do some work with ourselves and realize that, because nature, we're talking a lot, as I say, about emissions and carbon emissions and problems with this, but it doesn't move us emotionally. We still see them as things which for us are inanimate, not sacred and due and to the respect that we give to one another. So, India, again, just like the qi in China, they had a force from a very, very early stage, from about the 15th century, which they called Rita. I'm not sure, again, if that's the correct pronunciation, R-T-A, Rita. And it is just like qi. It is a force that is absolutely sacred, that runs through, that is within everything and everybody. It's certainly within every natural world, every natural thing. It's what they were doing. They were using their imagination, just like Wordsworth and Coleridge, seeing things that are not necessarily obvious, but which have a truth, and that has to be cultivated. Rita was the creative force, just like qi, from which every being emerged. All the gods. The gods are not the top of the tree. Rita, this force, is at the top of the tree. It rolls through all things, as Wordsworth had it. What happened was that as Rita coursed through the universe, first it produced the gods, the devas. They, in turn, each one of them, produced something in the natural world. Varuna, for example, separated the earth from the sky to make it habitable. Some created the sea. But the thing is, they didn't then retire from heaven to heaven and look down on the world they had created from afar, rather like our God. Instead, each one of these devas or gods, and this is mythology, imaginative mythology, of course, entered into the thing that he had created. So the god was in the sea. The god was in each flower. And people were taught to honor these things because they were all imbued with the sacred. And later they take this on philosophically and talk about, rather than poetically. That's important. The earliest surahs did not express this in cold scientific language. They used beautiful poetry, and poetry, often sung, Poetry moves us. Poetry is emotional. It is emotive. And it stays in our minds and hearts and makes us feel that we know something more intimately. And we have lost that. We talk, as I say, scientifically about nature, but we're not moved by the thought of its destruction. But the Judaism took a different form. It's instead of drawing on nature, it drew on the events of history, the events that had occurred in their own history. And this is important too. We should contemplate our history and see how we've got to where we are and how we can learn from the future. This is very important. But they focused on that rather than on nature. And so you have a sense of separation from nature, that you don't have much those beautiful poems that you have in China and India about nature. Instead, God does say to Adam, take the earth and subdue it. Make it your, and it sounds as though you're making it your own. Subdue it, not honor it. And you notice that when Moses is called, when he's a shepherd and he's going to be called by God, by Yahweh, to lead his people out of slavery in Egypt, he's tending his sheep, and he hears a voice coming from a bush, and he says, "Who are you?" And now a pagan would see the bush as sacred, but God separates himself from the bush and says, "I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob," back to history. And later, centuries later, Elijah, who is running away in great despair because he's fallen foul of the people who are about to kill him, he goes up to Mount Horeb and lies waiting for God to come to him. And various natural events occur. There's a terrible storm, there's a terrible wind, but God was not in the wind. God was not in the storm. And finally, God appears in just a gentle, gentle breeze. God is retreating from nature and is just felt as just on the margins of it. God says, "You know, I am the God of your fathers." And that is of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And it is about history. Now, history, it's very important to take history very seriously. We often don't do that enough today because we should be learning from history. But nature isn't there. And Jesus himself is deeply concerned about the political situation in Palestine under the Roman Empire. And quite rightly, he and St. Paul are interested in equality, human equality. This, again, is very important. But it does mean that nature gets pushed into a second subservient place. The focus in the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, is anthropocentric. It's focused on man. Listen to this psalm. "When I see the heavens, the work of your hands, the moon and the stars which you arranged. What is man that you should keep him in mind? Mortal man that you care for him. Yet you have made him little less than a god. With mercy and honor you crown him. You crown, giving him power over the works of your hands, putting all things under his feet. All of them, sheep and cattle, even the savage beasts, birds of the air and fish, that make their way from the waters are all under man. The one big difference, the one outstanding difference in the Hebrew Bible is the book of Job. And you remember that Job gets punished because he hasn't done anything wrong, but God has had a bet with Satan that he won't lose Job's faith. And he sends horrible afflictions onto Job, and Job is very sorry for himself, and he cries aloud about the sorrow, but it's all about me. And finally, after listening to all these complaints, God steps in, and he's furious. And he says, where were you when I created the world, when I took up the mountains and created the sea, and you don't have no idea. And he does this wonderful sort of journey through the animal kingdom, looking at the magnificence of these animals. Look, here's one about the horse. Are you the one, he says to Job, who makes the horse so brave and covers his neck with flowing hair? Do you make him leap like a grasshopper? His proud neighing spreads terror far and wide. Exultantly, he paws the soil of the valley and prances eagerly to meet the clash of arms. He laughs at fear. He's afraid of nothing. He recoils before no sword. On his back the quiver rattles, the flashing spear and javelin. Quivering with impatience, he eats up the miles. When the trumpet sounds, there is no holding him. Look at these animals, he said, just look at them. And at the end of them, Job says, I get it, I'm sorry. And realizes the limitations of his vision. Now, the one monotheism that is very good about nature, however, is Islam. The Quran sees nature, the natural world, the occurrences of the natural world, to be a revelation that is second only to the Quran itself. And if you think that this was being composed in what is now Saudi Arabia, in that absolutely ghastly climate, where there was never enough food for everybody, because there was no water, there was no farming, and they were perpetually in half-starved, the Arabs. They could only get food by fighting one another. And they had a way of doing it so that nobody got hurt, but you just took the food. But the Quran says no. Look at the order of nature. And it's very difficult for us to appreciate the Quran because we get it in an English translation, and it's okay. And I've picked out the most poetic one that I could find for you. But the Quran itself, the language in Arabic, is intensely moving. In the 1980s, I spent a lot of time in Israel-Palestine, and I remember one night I went out, we were on the West Bank driving around and with some young men, and they were all drinking beer, so they weren't good Muslims, you can put it that way. Muslims are not supposed to drink alcohol, but there they were drinking beer, and we were having a very jolly time. And then the Quran came on the car radio. And these young men were transfixed suddenly. And they kept on trying to, oh, Sekaran, I wish you could hear this. I wish you could hear it. And they tried to translate it. And they said, yes, it means that, but also that, also that, also that, because it's the words are so perfectly executed that it has multiple meanings. And they were almost in tears. Now, if I were driving around a country lane with some beer-drinking young West Englishmen, I don't think there would have been that, and readings from the New Testament came on, I don't think there'd be the same response. But I've never forgotten that. And it's important that we try to realize that the extraordinary beauty of the Quran was unlike any Arabic poetry of its time. And that spoke immediately, because we respond not by dry doctrines and dry ideas or philosophies, but to things like poetry, which get to the heart. We're moved by Wordsworth's beautiful poetry then. But the Quran, anyway, here it is, and it's the best I can do, but just try and imagine that as those young men did. The All-Merciful has taught the Quran. He created man, and he has taught him the explanation. The sun and the moon to a reckoning, and the stars and trees bow themselves, and the heaven, he raised it up and set the balance. Weigh with justice and skip not the balance. And earth, he set it down for all beings. Therein fruits and palm trees with sheaths, and grain in the blade, and fragrant herbs. Oh, which of your Lord's bounties will you and you deny? So we human beings, we are naturally disposed to fall in love with nature, but we have to cultivate that nature. And this requires imagination and poetry and beauty, so to make us look beneath the surface of things like Wordsworth did and sense a presence there. As long as we consider it just as a resource, we are not going to get it. And we'll find it very difficult to save the planet from the desecration that we are committing upon it daily. Now, the Neo-Confucians, in the 11th century, there was a big revival of Confucian ideology. Their thoughts still inform China today. There's a tremendous Confucian revival in China at the moment. It's quite easy to do that because it's not about God, as it were, so we're not about the supernatural, but it is about humanity and about the sacredness of humanity and how can we apply Confucius in a new way to the modern world. And there's a lot of interesting stuff and writing coming out of China at the moment, which I'm pursuing right now, which is very encouraging. But they said that we must treat every single thing in the natural world as we would wish to be treated ourselves. Again, that political, and that has still remained, as I say, in China, that presence of nature, that careful cultivation of it. Zhao Dongyi, one of these, he refused to cut the grass that grew under his window because he said, the feelings of the grass and me are the same. And that was a kind of discipline to him, to say nature has its own life. And we must imaginatively, that there's imagination again, imaginatively honor that. Look beneath the unpromising surface to the precious thing that's there. And there's a wonderful thing, I'll only read a little bit of it, called the Western Inscription. It's called that because the Confucian had it on the western wall of his study. And he said, heaven, and that meant the whole cosmic world, heaven is my father, and earth is my mother. And that which extends through the universe I consider my nature. All people are my brothers and sisters, and all things are my companions. And remember what things means in China, wanwu, which are alive and imbued with life. It'd be different from our own. We're not supposed to think that the grass thinks like us, or have fantasies about flowers or birds getting on with each other as we would. They're different from us. That's the whole point. Each one is a mystery. But each thing that we see in nature has its own life, its own needs, its own sacrality. So what we should be doing is, when we look at a tree, we can't imagine what is going on, but there is life there, a life that is different from our own, but is sacred and must be honoured. I live in the middle of London, and there's not much chance of much nature there. But over the row of houses opposite me, there's a massive tree, and it rises right up to the heavens. I think they'll have to cut it down at some stage. It's a bit of a danger. But the light, I watch from my study window, I watch this tree. It's changing, the life that goes in it, the birds that come in and out. And I try to remember that tree has an intrinsic life, separate from ours, unknowable to us, but there is life there, as there is in birds. And what we should be trying to do is looking at this, cultivating a sense of that inner life. Another the Neo-Confucian said we must form a trinity. We have a trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but it's all up in heaven. But this is a trinity of earth, humanity, and heaven. All three are partners, all three sacred in different ways. Now in India, the Jains have one thing in front. They don't spend a lot of time thinking about God, though the sacred is there with them constantly. And they don't have lots of rules and commandments and moral duties and prayers and stuff. They have one thing, ahimsa in Indian, which means no harm, doing no harm to others. And a Jain, this was invented, he was a bit earlier than the Buddha, just a little bit earlier than the Buddha. But they admitted women straight away into the order. So women were there alongside men. They weren't curtailed in any way. But they had one duty: not to hurt a single being, not to tread on a twig lest you harmed it, because each of these things had a life of its own. And if you look at a mushroom or something, you must honor it, because this mushroom, they said, in its next life, it'll be higher and higher and higher, and gradually it can become human, and then it can become a god, but only if it commits no harm to another single person. There's no, as I say, no yoga, just a concern. Even a stone had a jiva, a spirit in it, and experienced pain. Not like us, not pain like us, but there is some kind of life that is utterly mysterious from us, and which we will never know. Never pluck fruit, said Mahavira. Wait for it to fall to the ground of its own accord. Walk carefully, lest you crush an insect. Don't move at night, because you might damage something. Never pluck fruit. To do harm to others is to do harm for oneself, because we and other things share some kind of life. that must be honoured, a life of empathy. The Jains, they spend a great deal of time praying to the gods, but their daily prayer ends like this: I ask pardon from all living creatures. May all creatures pardon me. May I have friendship with all creatures and empathy with none. So we can't have indifference to these things. We have to see each thing before us as precious, and that creates. If we are not in harmony with nature, we cannot hope for harmony within our human communities either, because this is our home; it's where we live. So, how can we cultivate this? Just take Confucius and remember the golden rule. Never treat others as you would not like to be treated yourself. Apply that, not just to one another, though we have to do that with one another. Look at the state of the world at the moment. Not treat others as you would not be treated ourselves. The suffering, the pain, the horror in Ukraine every day. But also nature, which is suffering and utterly damaged, but through our own carelessness. Now, the Chinese practice, sometimes some mental disciplines can help. And the Chinese have a sort of practice that appears in nearly all their works, the early works, of concentric circles. A way of thinking about the world that they said goes right back to the 23rd century BCE. And it's obviously legendary, but they're talking about their earliest kings who devised a system whereby they first began in their own homes to honor each person in their own home. Then they spread it out to the local community, the neighborhood, honoring each person without exception in that neighborhood, learning, however unpleasant or difficult they may be, thinking of them as equals and as precious. Then moving out to the city, then moving out to a neighboring state, and finally to the whole world. You can't stop with your own people. You must be spreading out concentrically circles every day, going further and further away. And the Buddha. I want to finish with him, because we don't often think of the Buddha as talking about compassion, and we hear about him talking about compassion, but not much. We see him, don't we? The statues of him, the icons of him. There he is, sitting, usually his face turning inwards, deep in yoga, deep in a trance within himself. But actually, the Buddhist texts tell us something very different happened. He didn't achieve enlightenment by going down into himself and becoming at peace with himself and at one with himself. He did it by spreading outwards. He extended his sympathies first to people, following this concentric circles idea that we had in China, first to his own household, then to the next, his country, then to the whole world, and not until he had expunged all sense of hostility from his heart, and extended only sympathy and affection and honor and love to every single creature on the planet. Only then did he achieve nirvana. Now, none of us are probably going to have time for that. A lot of people do yoga today, but this is not yoga as practiced by the Buddha and his contemporaries when yoga was first invented way back a long time ago. If an aspirant wanted to learn to be in yoga in order to achieve enlightenment, he or she, there were women there too, had to go into the forest and live with a guru. But first, they had to practice a moral discipline. And they were not allowed to even speak an unkind word, make an impatient gesture, or horrible, or just, sneer, a sneering smile. Until and unless that empathy to all was absolutely ingrained in your nature, and the guru would be watching you, and you'd be there for months before you were even allowed to sit in the yogic position. So yoga, it's like the Buddha. It's not about yourself. It's about extending your sympathy to every single creature, and that it would include, this being India, every single animal in the forest, every single insect that bit you, every single tree, but to feel honor and respect for it. Well, yoga was a full-time job. You didn't just go on a couple of mornings a week. It was all day and every day. On one occasion, the Buddha, he was approached by some tribal people called the Kalamans. And they said, look, we want to be enlightened. We want to join in with this, but we can't do yoga all day long. We've got sort of animals to look after, and we haven't got the time. And anyway, I'm not sure we're up to it, really. It's very demanding. And he said, don't worry, Kalamans. I've got a prayer for you. And I love this prayer, and I'm going to end on this, because I think this is what we need today in our broken world, our broken human world, which is in terrible danger at the moment, and our natural world, which is in pain too, and being daily, carelessly vitiated by us. It's slightly like the concentric circles idea. So here it is. It's quite short. Let all beings be happy. Now, you notice he's saying beings. He's not saying let all people be happy, but all beings. Every twig, every insect, every animal. Let all beings be happy, weak or strong, of high, middle, or low estate, small or great, visible or invisible, near or far away, alive or still to be born. May they all be entirely happy. Let nobody lie to anybody or despise any single being anywhere. May nobody wish harm to any single creature out of anger or hatred. Let us cherish all creatures as a mother her only child. May our loving thoughts fill the whole world, above, below, across, without limit, a boundless goodwill toward the whole world, unrestricted, free of hatred and enmity. Thank you.